Hi folks, welcome to another Tuesday evening practice session. Let's start with the bear. So, good old bear, shifting and turning, feeling the whole body relax. Head top suspended with the open body hanging down. The feet quiet on the ground. Bubbling wells open to earth. Tripod in each foot, stable on the ground. Mind resting in the dantian. Calm, quiet. Hands and arms moving through the air as if it had the substance of water. Feeling the air part right in front of the heart of the palm that's swinging in front of you. And relaxing the whole body. Give it another swing or two. And take a break. So what we're going to work on today is aspects of opening and closing in the hip joints. And so I want to do some work that will really help you see how when one hip joint is closing, the other is opening, and vice versa. One is opening, the other is closing. So the two hip joints are out of phase with each other. You know, if I use my hands and I go like this, then you see the two hands are not making the same motion. Even if halfway through that I stop and the two hands are in the same place, one of the hands is closing and the other hand is opening. So even if you look superficially in one static place and it looks like the two hip joints are doing the same thing, they're always going in different directions. Opening and closing means for a joint, like for the elbow, it's easy. When I close my elbow, the two parts of the body on either side of the joint come towards each other. And when I open the elbow, the two parts on either side of the joint move away from each other. Right? So it's just like a door. When you close a door, the door and the frame are with each other. And when you open the door and the frame move apart from each other. So, you know, this isn't some esoteric idea. It's a simple mechanical thing. On the shoulders, when you close the shoulder, then the arm is moving towards the front of the body. And when you open the shoulder, the arm is moving away from the body. In the hip joints, when you close a hip joint, the pelvis moves towards the leg. When you open a hip joint, the pelvis and the leg move apart from each other. So open and close. The thing about the hip joints is that they don't do the same thing. The shoulders, because the arms don't carry weight, the two shoulder joints do often do the same thing. Sometimes they do different things. Single whip, one shoulder joint is closed, the arm and the body have moved towards each other. The other shoulder joint is open, the arm and the body have moved away from each other. But push, both shoulder joints are closed. I can probably come up with one if I think about it for a second where they're both open. But that's the way it is. The shoulders don't have to do different things because they're not carrying weight. The legs are carrying weight, and because we're always trying to separate empty and full, the two hip joints do different things. So let's look at this shifting and turning separated exercise. We've done this before, and what I want you to do is to really pay attention to the way that the two hip joints are moving out of phase with each other. So start out in a 70-30, exactly square. In this, the front hip joint has closed. There's a crease in the front quad. The rear hip joint has opened. The leg is hanging. Now make a mistake in this and leave the front hip joint open. When you do that, your waist won't be square to the front, right? These haven't come towards each other. I'm not sure if I can figure out how to close the rear hip joint here and make that mistake. So you're in a 70-30. You sit back without turning. And now turn towards the rear leg, the outside of the rear leg. As you do that, you close the rear hip joint and you let the front hip joint open, moving away from the front leg. Move forward without turning, so you're still facing the corner. Now close the front hip joint and release the rear hip joint. Sit back, turn, closing the rear hip joint, opening the front hip joint. It may help to put your hands on the quads so you can feel this. Forward, close the front, let the rear open. Again, back, closing the rear, opening the front. Forward, closing the front, opening the rear. Do it on the other side for a second. So same deal. Start out square. Make sure the front hip joint is closed. If the front hip joint is open, you won't be square. You crease the front quad. That brings you square. Let the rear leg go. Sit back without turning. Turn towards the outside of the rear leg, closing the rear hip joint, opening the front. Come forward. Close the front. Open the rear. Sit back. Close the rear. Open the front. Come forward. Close the front, open the rear. Once more, back, rear hip joint creases, front hip joint releases, forward, front hip joint folds, rear hip joint releases. Okay, so what we want to work on is this feeling of both actively closing and actively opening. So you want to do this deliberately. A lot of times doing the 70-30 work that we're just doing, you'll come back and you'll do a fine job of closing the rear, but you won't make sure that the front opens. And look what happened to my knee when I did that. And so you can see if I do this again, I come back, watch the relationship between my pelvis and my thigh. It's not changing, right? There's no opening there. That door is not opening. It's just staying the way that it was. And you see what happened to my knee here. This is going to be really trouble. And if I come forward now, and then I try to go into the 70-30, the knee has to move while it's got weight on it. That's bad. That'll hurt your knees. So that's a thing to pay attention to. If your knees are hurting, this exercise can be really good for helping you find where you're creating a misalignment. For right now, though, I want you to sit back, and as you close the rear hip joint, feel the front hip joint opening. This isn't a doing. I'm not pushing my knee out. That would make the front hip joint engaged. What is happening is, as I turn my body, I let these muscles here passively get stretched. So if you just sit on the back leg and turn towards the front leg and away from the front leg, right? So one thing that'll happen here is the rear hip joint is closing and then opening and closing and opening. And that's pretty easy to feel because you're on that leg. Pay attention to the front hip joint. So as you turn away from the leg, the front hip joint gets passively stretched. As you turn back towards the leg without shifting, the front hip joint gets passively closed. So the back hip joint is the one that's doing all the work. The front hip joint is getting both passively closed and passively opened. Change to the other side. Sit back all the way and just do it on the rear leg. Turn, letting the front hip joint get opened. Turn back towards the front, letting the front hip joint get closed. So the front hip joint isn't doing it. You're aware of it happening. You make sure it happens, but you're not engaged. And then you come back to the front. So what's happening is the muscle fibers and the muscles across the front of the quad are getting stretched, and then they're getting pushed back together. This is happening from the shape. You leave this leg alone, and as you turn back and forth, you let that hip joint be worked, closing and opening. And if you do what I'm doing, you put your hands on either side of the hip joint, you'll feel the fingers coming closer together and moving farther away from each other, opening and closing. So I'll go back to the first side and do it with the shifting and turning. And what I want you to do is know that only one of the two hip joints is engaged, the one with the weight. The other one passively responds as it opens. So I start out in a 70-30, I sit back. My rear hip joint is engaged. It's going to draw me towards the outside. And as it does that, the front hip joint passively gets opened, stretched. Shift forward. Now the weight's in the front. The front hip joint is going to be engaged. It's going to draw me towards the front while the rear hip joint gets passively stretched and opened. Back, close the rear, let the front be opened. Forward, close the front, let the rear be opened. Back, close the rear, let the front be opened. Forward, close the front, let the rear be opened. Once more on this side. Back, closing the rear, letting the front passively get stretched. Forward, close the front, let the rear passively get stretched. Change sides. I'm really wanting you to feel this passive opening as it happens on each hip joint. So sit back, turn towards the outside of the rear leg, actively engaging the rear hip joint, which turns you, letting the front hip joint passively get stretched open. Forward, engage the front, let the rear stretch. Back, engage the rear, let the front be opened. Forward, engage the front, let the rear be opened. So the two hip joints are doing different things. And the one that's closing in this move is the active one. The one that gets opened is doing that in response to the other closing. The closing is engaged, the active is the opening is responsive. So closing is active, opening is responsive, passive. Once more, sitting back, close the rear, open the front, forward, close the front, open the rear. Now, it's not always the case that closing is active and opening is passive or responsive. In this exercise, that's the way it is. But there's, like going into white crane. When I start out in shoulder strike, my front hip joint is closed, my rear hip joint is open. And as I go into white crane, the front hip joint is going to actively open. That's the leg that I'm using. That's the one that's driving all the motion. So that's an active opening. And the rear hip joint is going to close because I turn towards that leg. That's a passive closing. So it's not the case that opening is always passive and closing is always active. Those are independent, orthogonal dimensions. So, you've got opening and closing, you've got active and passive, and you can make 4 combinations between those. You can see what they are. It's easiest to feel in these exercises where the closing is active and the opening is responsive to that. It's being caused by the other one. The thing you can do is forget to make sure that the opening actually happens. And instead you just hold this static and you turn, and then that causes the knee problem. So when you're doing this, make sure you are very aware of the opening hip joint, but you don't do it, you don't make it happen, forcing it, engaging it. You let it happen because it's responsive to the closing on the other side. And as you do this, if you don't do this regularly, you're definitely going to feel it across your quads. You're going to feel those muscles getting used because you're making them slide back and forth, the muscle fibers. And they may be used to just staying in one place and moving as a unit rather than sliding back and forth. So you'll feel something in there. And getting this feeling of opening as a deliberate thing and opening as the result of the engaged closing is important. This is in the bear too. So do the bear a little bit. And in the bear, the active hip joint is the closing one. That's what draws you towards the outside of the leg. And as you do that, let the other hip joint be stretched away. And now, in an instant, change the one that's open, draw it closed, and let the other hip joint be stretched open. And then change. Draw the open one closed, and allow the closed one to passively open. So do this for a little bit in the bear, and notice that change in an instant from opening to now actively closing. Engaged closing, drawing me towards the outside of the leg. Engaged closing, drawing me towards the other outside of the leg. You can put your hands on your hip joints so you feel the change happening in there. One of them is closing, the other is in response, getting opened. Then it changes. It actively closes, and the first responds by being opened. So this goes back and forth as you do this. And one of the important things here, this is a change of yin and yang, empty and full, is that it happens in an instant. I don't then use both hip joints, move myself over, and do something. I've reached the extreme of open, and now I change, and this hip joint engages and pulls me towards its leg. And then this hip joint engages and pulls me towards its leg. So one hip joint at a time is doing work. The other hip joint is allowing itself to get pulled open, letting go bit by bit by bit by bit as you go back and forth. One hip joint is active, the other is responsive. In this motion again, the active hip joint is the closing hip joint. And the responsive hip joint is the hip joint that's getting opened. So really try to feel that difference between the two hip joints. Great. So hopefully you feel that. If you're watching this video and you don't feel the difference between the two hip joints, put it on pause. Go through the bear and that shifting and turning exercise some more on your own. Come back and watch it again until you really feel the difference. You understand the difference between open and close, and you understand the difference between an active closing that makes the other one get stretched open, and an active closing that makes the other one get stretched open. So really, this is really important, and it's going to be the basis for everything else we do for the rest of this hour. So really make sure you get that. If you've got an idea and you've got more refinement on it to do, great, keep playing along now. But if this is just gibberish, rewind, do it again from the beginning, work on the bear and the shifting and turning until you get that glimmer. So let's do a first third. And in this first third, I want you to really notice that the two hip joints are doing different things. It's obvious some places, like going into ward off left. As I go into ward off left, the front hip joint closes and the rear hip joint opens. And then I go into ward off right, and the front hip joint closes and the rear hip joint opens. Some places it's easy to think that both close or both open, in particular going into single whip. When I'm in push and I sit back, now I close the rear hip joint and I let the front hip joint be stretched open. That's part of letting this leg hang. If instead you pull the two knees together, this is actively closing both of the hip joints. This will put you in a difficult, unsustainable place. So one closes, the other opens, then I change. The right closes while the left opens. And then it's easy when you go into the final posture of single whip to feel like what you're doing is trying to open both of them, right? Like some kind of enormous plie or something. You're not. Even there, as you're sitting into one hip joint, you're letting it be creased while the other opens. So this isn't trying to get both as open as I can. I go ahead and leave my rear hip joint closed, and then I close the front, let the rear open as I go into the final posture. So that second bit when we step may take you some time, but you should be able to notice coming from push, closing the rear, letting the front hang and be open, changing, closing the right, letting the left hang and be open. So we'll do a first third, and I don't care if you get the first third wrong, if you miss a move, if there's, a mistake. What I want you to do is pay all your attention to the hip joints, closing and opening. So, from the top. And go ahead. Okay, and now pay attention to the two hip joints. As you turn to the right, you turn towards your right foot. That hip joint is closing, and then the left hip joint is opening. Shift. Ward off. Left. Shift and square. Front hip joint closes, rear hip joint opens. Ward off right. Step. Shift. As you turn square, front hip joint closes, rear hip joint opens. Front hip joint closes even more when you turn to the corner. Continuing. I'm not going to talk through every single one of them. As you turn, close the left hip joint, let the right be stretched open. Shift, turn to the right, close the right hip joint, let the left be stretched open. Extending the hook and stepping. Final posture of single whip, close the front hip joint, let the rear be stretched open. As you go into shouldering, notice that the front is closing, the rear is opening. And now white crane, right hip joint opens, left hip joint closes because you're turning towards the leg. Close the front, let the rear become open. As you square, close the front, let the rear hip joint be opened. Right hip joint is very open, and now close it as you turn to the right. Close the left, right opens. Left closes even more, right opens even more. Close the right, let the left leg stay behind so the left hip joint is opened. And then you can shift. Cross hands. And stand up. Now again, for all of this, you have to look at the action or the doing rather than the static state. You know, the little thing I keep doing with my hands. Now, if I showed you a freeze frame here, you can't tell which hand is doing which. But they're doing different things. They're not both closing or both opening. They're one closing, one opening. So when you're looking at this in the form, don't spend a lot of time looking for the static state. Look for the direction of change that's happening in the hip joints. That's what you want. You want opening and closing, not opened and closed. So you can, it can be confusing if you look at it in the static state, but look at the action that's happening. Let's do push into single whip again for a second so that you really get that. Take it. I'll face this way for push. Beth will face the same way that you face, so that you can see. So sit back, and now turn and leave your front leg behind, feeling that hip joint get open, and then release it, and stop here at the end of the turn. Make sure your right leg is hanging, and put your left hand in the crease of your left quad. The front of the pelvis and the thigh should be coming really close to each other, and the right should be flat and hanging. And now shift to the right and close the right and leave the front. So there's actually a turn there. You leave your left leg hanging long, open, and you crease the right hip joint. So do that again. Back into push. Sit back. close the rear hip joint, let the front hang open, shift the weight, turn to the right, closing the right, letting the left hang open. And once more from push. Sit back, close, letting the right hip joint hang open, shift, close the right, letting the left knee hang, left hip joint hang open. Take a break. So a lot of times people miss that turn back to the right, and you get something that's more like this. And you see, I didn't change. And it can happen because you sort of run into yourself. If you pull the knees together here, everything will be engaged and you won't be able to turn. So what you have to do is really let the right knee hang so that you've got this flat quad on the right side. Shift the weight, and now you've got something you can actually close. Turn to the right, and as you do that, let the left knee hang. This feeling of the hanging leg is an awful lot like what you're going to have in the back leg of a 70-30, which we'll talk about in a second. So do it again, and really make sure you get that. When you sit back and turn, the left hip joint closes and the right opens. When you shift and turn, the right closes and the left opens. So from push, sitting back, close the left, let the right knee hang, the right hip joint is open. Shift, close the right, let the left knee hang, the left hip joint gets opened. Again, sit back, turn, letting the right hip joint be stretched open. Shift, and now actively close the right, letting the left be stretched open. Once more from push. Sit back, turn, left closing, right getting opened. Shift, turn, right engaged, closing, left getting stretched open. Great. So the last thing I want to talk about briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Beth, is the back leg in a 70-30. So when I'm in the 70-30, I want my back leg to hang. So that's why I said it's like going into single whip. So the back leg is open and hanging. The knee is down. The knee is in a line from the center of the hip joint down to the bubbling well. So I don't want the knee to drop in. This is a totally passive leg. And I don't want to push the knee out. Sometimes people think knee over toe means that if I came over here and looked, I should see down here. No. That's not the place you look from. You look from inside the hip joint, and there should be a diagonal line running down through the knee to the bottom of the foot. And that's what I'm going for. So stand in a 70-30, either one. No, I don't care. We'll do both. And really feel that back leg. Make sure the front hip joint is creased. Feel that the rear hip joint is flat hanging. It's been pulled open. And now make the mistakes with the rear leg. Let the knee fall in so that the thigh is almost vertical. Feel how that rotates. It rolls your foot onto the inside blade of the foot. And then get the knee back so it's on a line down to the bottom of the bubbling well. Push the knee out. That'll roll the foot onto the outside. Change sides, do it on the other side. Square in the front. Rear hip joint is hanging open. The knee is on a line from the ball and socket inside there through the knee down to the bubbling well. Let the leg collapse so that the thigh is almost vertical to the ground. Feel how it rolled your foot to the inside. Bring the knee back so it's on a line. Push it out. See how that rolls your foot onto the outside. Come back. So if you feel the tripod in the rear foot and you can get that stretchy, alive feeling in the rear leg, you'll have a leg which is empty, your weight's being carried on the front, but alive with the hip joint open. So you really want to have that feeling. We'll spend more time on this, but it's key for 70-30s. Open, closed. Okay. I'll turn it over to Beth now, and she'll do some more on opening and closing.
So I want to look at what happens to the leg that you're standing on when you step. Because often this is the moment that the knee loses alignment, the foot rolls on the ground, and we get problems. So, for example, going from, say, word off left to word off right. So, word off left, and then I'm going to step for word off right. I need to leave this leg behind. That means the knee continues to point that way as I step, so that I continue opening this joint. If instead, when I turn to step, my leg does this, now I'm in trouble. My weight. So when I step, if I don't let it keep opening and keep the knee this way, what's going to happen is this. Now the weight has rolled to the inside of my foot. I'm not standing there for very long because you can't, it will hurt. So the weight rolls to the inside of the foot, the knee falls in, the joint is static, it doesn't change. It's like moving this way. I don't want it to take everything on my full leg around with me when I'm stepping with the empty leg. I want the full leg to stay in place, and I turn over it and around it, and then when I take a step, this is still opening so that I can make the step and leave this behind. So the foot has a good connection. All 3 points are on the ground, equally connected, and I'm opening toward the direction I'm opening away from that leg so that I can get the foot to step. If you have trouble with this, I'm going to pull out a chair. It's always useful to spend a little time. Let me see, how do I want to do this? Grabbing a hold of something to keep your balance so that you don't have to worry about losing your balance, so that you can work the joint actually properly. So from here, and go ahead and grab a hold of something, it's useful. You're going to turn away from that full leg. And as you do that, the knee should not, if it changes, it only changes in the same dimension as your toes are pointing. So you want to sit away from the leg, away from the knee. The thigh here is all opening away, and there's a stretch. This is a good reason to hold on to this so that you get that stretch and can take a step. I'm not even worried about the step at this point, just that you are reaching with one foot away from the leg that you're standing on. This is really important to keeping your alignment and saving your knees. So you can do this on either side, and don't worry about anything but the leg that you're standing on. And you're in your 70-30, and then you put all your weight into it. The knee continues going toward your toe. When you start to turn to take a step, you need to be opening right here, opening away from that leg. So you can go ahead and hold on to your chair so that you can sit down and get this feeling of the knee continuing to point in the direction of your toes. And it will be a bit of a stretch to open right here as you step. But notice the difference between that and this. It's huge. So you don't want to let that fall in. If you do that, your knees will start to hurt, and you won't be able to really get a feel for this opening and closing thing, because both of them, the one leg isn't changing as you do that. So let's just do a little bit of going in and out of 70-30s. You can make it be ward-offs if you want, or you can hold on to something and just, put it in a position where you can go back and forth and have something to keep your stability so that you can really work this feeling. But I'm going to go back and forth from one ward off to the other. So the way that it works if you use your hands is you start in ward off left, you turn, you take a step, you come into ward off right, make a ball of air, right hand on top, turn to the corner, take another step. So we're just going back and forth in our 70-30s, and if you want to just do it with the legs and feel what's happening, that's okay too. So make sure that the knee of the leg you're standing on is following the line of the toes. Take a step, shift. Now you're going to close this joint and let this one open. You can close this a little more as you gather and turn. Now this one is opening. You're moving away from that leg. When you step, you can also take your hand and put it inside your thigh so that you help yourself remember to leave that there as you make the step. Now it's going to be closing toward the front leg. Get all your weight in the front leg. As you turn away from it, feel that leg being stable. When I put my hand here, it helps me feel the stability of that leg. And then if it starts rolling, I'm going to feel that right, not only at the bottom of my foot, but I'll feel it at my hand. So you can use that as another mechanism for knowing what's happening. Keep that leg out there as you take another step. So this ability to step weightless isn't just about emptying the front leg. It's not just, okay, I'm in my 70-30 and I'm going to step. Okay, so you see what happened here? I lost this leg and then I'm hauling this one up, but I don't have a good leg to stand on, so the separation doesn't quite work. And if you look at what's happening in the two joints at that point, I'm falling in toward myself. Both joints are kind of grabbing to help me. I'll face this way and do it. And if I start to turn and all this is coming with me, this is not opening, and then I don't have a place to stand from. I want this to be stable, like planting a pole or a post, and then rotate on top of it so that all this stays stable. Then, when I step, I want to keep that. Part of what that means is I may not be stepping where I think I need to go. I need to step where my body can put me and not disturb this stable leg. That's part of what it means to really separate the weight, is that the leg you're standing on is stable so that you can place the other foot, and then when you place it without losing the stability of the leg you're on, that's where your stance goes. If it's not where you want it to be, you need to figure out what's going on that's keeping it from getting you where you want to be. But the answer is not to just, we'll do this a lot where we are doing a nice separation form and we say, place your empty foot, check it, and people check it, and then we say, okay, shift. And then they do this because they're used to a bigger stance than they can separate to. So you want to let that be your guideline for where your stance needs to be. And if it ends up feeling too narrow or whatever, too short, then you need to look at what's going on that's creating that, not, oh, okay, I separated my foot, now I haul it to this other place where I'm not separated anymore. Really try to understand what you need to do to get your legs to go where you want them to go. So let's take it, actually let's do like up to single whip, just that much of the form. And we'll be careful about how we step and become aware of that relationship of the knee with the foot and turning away from it, and see how that goes. So let's take it from the top. And begin. So even there, when you step, whichever leg you're on, that's a stable leg. And the rest of you can move around it without disturbing the quality of how the foot connects to the ground or where your knee is pointing. Now, right away here, we have this problem. So you sit into the left leg, knee is pointing same direction as the left toes. You need to turn away from that leg, that thigh, the whole structure stays stable. Now you shift, and the leg you're shifting onto, the whole structure stays stable. You turn to the corner, and as you step, keep that leg in place. And if it means you don't get the stance that you thought you were going for, well, you can work on that next. So here's another opportunity to stabilize the leg that you're standing on so that you can step weightless. That's where your leg goes. And feel that you have one leg that stays stable as you turn. So now you're turning on top of a leg. It needs to stay stable, not a wobbly knee. Coming forward, now your right leg is stable. Sit onto the back leg and come forward. And back to good old single whip. Sitting onto the back leg and turn. That leg is stable. As you shift to the right leg, now the right leg is stable. The left knee can drop because it's empty. And now this is a great big step. As you reach with the left foot, make sure that the foot that you're standing on doesn't wobble and that the knee keeps pointing toward the toes until it's time to shift. Great, rest your legs. So the really big steps, and then of course we get past the first third and the steps are even bigger, but it's always the same situation where you want this to be stable and then it can go this way, but you don't want it to go this way at all. Now the other issue is when we say sit back. How are you resting on your back leg? So we do going from push, and if we say sit back, and this happens, you see what I'm doing here, how my hip is getting caught in the sitting back. Now when I go to turn, watch what happens. I can't do it stable because I've already kind of taken a piece of the stability and removed it so that it's a little bit going out my hip. So I don't want to sit back into a unstable, unsustaining place, because then when I try to turn, I can't keep this leg stable. It starts wobbling the whole structure around because I'm not sitting nicely on top of my leg. So part of separating the weight is actually being aligned on whichever leg is your full leg so that things can move around it and not be disturbed in the motion. So the key is to think about sitting on top of your back leg rather than sitting back. Tends to make you sit out on the hip a little bit. Now I'm exaggerating. You might not do it that much and still be losing that moment. So what you want to do is feel that you're on top of your back leg, on top of your back leg. Get yourself really on top of the back leg so that your alignment is such that then when you go to turn, you're just rotating on top of something stable rather than having a break already, that then when you go to turn, watch what happens. My hip, my outer side of my hip starts wobbling with me. It turns in a unsustainable way, and I don't have a good connection down here at the foot. So get onto, you can do this with me. Sit on top of your back leg, and notice that from there you can kind of, choose your height, but that it doesn't change this. And then when I turn, I'm turning around something. Yeah, it's turning still because it's moving, but it's not swinging wildly out. It's just inside the shape of the post that you've created with your rear leg. So if we look at that beginning exercise that Lee was doing and pay some attention to this aspect of it, you can just do this for a couple times on each side. But when you sit onto your back leg, before you turn, make sure you're really on top of it and not hanging off the back of it, but really on top of it. And then you can turn, and there's a nice stable feeling. Now come forward. Usually we're better at being on top of it when it's the front leg. And as you turn, the front leg is stable. You come onto the back leg, nice and stable. The knee is not going to wobble when you turn over it. And come forward. And then just for the feeling, I don't want to do this much because it can hurt, sit and just think back and let there be a little bit of a break here, and then try to turn and notice what happens. So get yourself back on top of that leg. Make sure that you're not breaking your stable leg at the hip. You want to sit on top of it, come forward, sit on top of it, change feet. So you may have more trouble on one side than the other. So just become aware of it. Sit on top of your back leg, get all the weight back there, feel aligned and stable. Notice how your leg, the back leg is, and then you can turn over it, come forward, and you can turn away from it. Sitting on top of that leg and turning over the leg. The knee can go this way, right over the toe, but it will not wobble with the turn. When you go ahead and do this once, sit back and let it disturb that alignment. And then notice what happens with the leg when you try to turn. The things start wobbling around and the knee gets a little mobile. So you want the knee to be stable on whichever leg you're turning on top of. Whichever leg has your weight needs to have the weight dropping straight down through to the ground and not getting caught in the knee, not wobbling the foot, and in particular when you go to take a step. So rest your legs a minute and shake them out. And let's do that same segment of the form again from the beginning. So feel both feet, good connection through the ground, sitting up on top of your legs. And as you lower yourself to the ground, make sure you're doing it on top of the leg and step. Turn and Let yourself really be connected all the way through. Raise hands. So, sitting onto your left leg and turning away from the left leg, keeping the left foot solid on the ground. Shift. And step. Nice and stable on the left leg. Feel the bottom of your foot. Sit up on top of your leg. Move away from the whole thigh as you step. And onto the back leg. Sitting up on top of that back leg so that you can just turn easily, leaving the front foot behind the front thigh, and then shift. Now sit on top of your back leg, and push. And here's where it really starts to become obvious. Sit on top of your rear leg, and turn. Turning on top of that leg, keep it stable. Now you're going to change to the other leg. You're on top of it. You can turn. The other one lets go. And unwind. And pay close attention to how the leg goes as you step. And complete the move. And rest your legs. So this place here, if when I shift, I sit back, right away I'm in trouble. My weight is in my heel. I can feel it. I'm kind of already hanging back. I go to turn, I'm throwing this hip out. I can't stay upright. I can't get this leg in very much. And then I go to shift, and the same thing happens here. Now I've gone out this hip, and I have no room to turn. That could be another one of the reasons when Lee said a lot of people have trouble turning to the right. This could be one of the reasons. There's no turn here because I'm not in a place where I can actually turn. So if you feel like you don't have much turn, chances are your alignment is off, and then it will be very hard to take steps without hurting your knees and to make good turns. You will have more turn if you can just get yourself aligned up there. One of the problems with this is we think about going low. So when I'm going to sit into my back leg, I can artificially go lower. If I fall off the top of my leg, see, I've come lower, but I'm not in a good position. When I get in a good position, I had to come up higher to do so. Then, if I want to go lower, it's going to be this way, not this way, falling off the edge. It may seem more relaxed. You know, you're standing at the grocery checkout line or whatever. This seems relaxed. You know, doing this takes some work, and so you think, oh, relax, yeah. Well, but you want to relax in a good shape. So early on in our Tai Chi career, I remember Jane telling us about this and trying to get us to feel that we were up on top of the leg and not letting it go out the hip. And she said, okay, I never ever want to see anybody stand like this ever again, anytime. Not just when we're doing Tai Chi, but ever. Don't, because she'd start talking like I'm talking now, and people would stand around like this. No, I never, ever, ever want to see you do that. You're teaching yourself that a comfortable, relaxed place to go to is a place that actually throws you off balance right from the start. You might think, oh, well, but see, I can pick up this foot a lot easier when I do this. Whoa, now it's harder to pick up my empty foot. Yes, but you're doing it in a more aligned way. So be super attentive to what's actually happening. The bottoms of your feet will always tell you where your weight is going. And if you just stand here, I'll let you do this just with this one time. Stand here, feel the bottom of your foot. Do the thing that feels like, oh yeah, just hanging out, being comfortable. Where's the weight on your foot? Listen to it. It will tell you where the weight has gone. Now, get the weight equal and see how that changes where it puts you on your leg. This information will help you understand where to go. So let's do that. I bet we can do a whole first third. We'll do a little bit of a snappy one, but now you've got all this stuff to pay attention to and think about. So let's do a final first third. So get your footing. Feel your hip joints. Sit up on top of them and begin. Paying attention to that foot and leg as you step. Sitting on top of your back leg. And again. Hip joints keep changing. The stable leg doesn't wobble. Left knee is pointing with the left toes. These 90-degree stances are challenging. Leaving the right knee over the right toes. Right leg is stable. Left leg is stable. So this is all part of what it takes to be able to truly separate the weight. So it's well worth spending your time practicing this and getting that feeling.